All right, welcome to the next installment of the CrySP speaker series on privacy. Today we're very lucky to have Dr. Christopher Parsons. Dr. Parsons is the managing director of the Telecom Transparency Project, as well as a postdoctoral fellow at the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. And he's going to be talking to us about lawful access. Let's welcome Chris.
Well, let me start by thanking Ian and all the rest of you for having me and for coming. This is an area that I spend probably as much time as you do in your own research, thinking, working, dealing with, and it's always nice to be able to speak with other people about the work that we're doing at the lab and also areas that we're going to be moving forward into. And so I'm going to be talking specifically about lawful access in the Canadian scenario. So as you'll see, my focus, unsurprisingly as a political scientist, is in the politics. How exactly is it this issue has come up time and time and time and time and time and time again, and why hasn't it advanced any further? Why don't we have laws yet? And for those that are interested in continuing the opposition to these expanded surveillance powers, what are the lessons that we can draw from what we've seen to date? So just to give you an idea as to what I'm going to talk about, so that we're all sort of on the same roadmap, I'm going to start by really quickly explaining what I mean by the term agenda setting, drawing from the political science literatures and the policy literatures, and then give a primer on what lawful access powers are in general, as we've seen them in successive iterations of legislation in Canada, and then go into sort of the nitty-gritty of how has it arisen, who are the actors that have been involved, and interestingly, how did we almost get lawful access legislation without a single bill ever being passed? Where was the government almost wholly successful in expanding the surveillance infrastructure of this country with one secret document and one change of term? And then I'll identify some of the lessons that we've learned over the past decade and a half or so, and then conclude with what are some steps forward based on this talk is built out of a book chapter that I drafted in February this year when I was more depressed than I was now. And so we've seen a lot of change and shift and action actually around lawful access over the past several months. So what's going on and how might that affect how lawful access is deployed or not deployed as legislation in Canada going forward? So just to begin with, what is agenda setting? At the highest level, it is a way that various actors, be they in the media, be they members of the public, or members of the political class, so politicians or bureaucrats or something like that, how they identify the key issues, how they rank them. This ranking isn't necessarily a 1 to 10 list. It can be. And it isn't necessarily formal. So it could be something like a long-running series of newspaper articles, in the case of the media. In the case of the public, it could be those issues that we talk about. And especially on the public agenda, things can rise and vanish very quickly. So you can think of a news story that hits today and is gone tomorrow, or something that lingers and percolates and sits long-term. So for some people, some elements of the public, it could be climate change, it could be lawful access, it could be human rights, it could be any number of issues that you could think of. And then there's the political way of setting something on an agenda. So in politics, you get a variety of different mechanisms that this can happen. So the most obvious way is there's a bill that gets put on the order paper. We're going to debate passing law X. But there's also a whole series of internal discussions. What legislation is important? What are the problems facing the country? What solutions do we have? And what problems do we have? And can they mesh together? So we can get into a whole series of different ways of understanding how issues are ranked on these various agendas. Now, in terms of the media, what are their primary role? Their focal goal is to amplify, translate, or link issues between the public the political agendas for the purposes of my talk. So this means that the media is intermediating between the public, i.e. us, and politicians and bureaucrats who are working through issues. The public agenda is just the items of the day that we're paying attention to. And American political science literature identifies that most of the public is never able at a general level to handle more than 5 to 7 items at any one time. So it's a very limited period of time, a very limited period of space to make something important to the public writ large. And then finally, as I mentioned, for politicians, you see issues rise on the agenda in the form of bills, campaign promises, privately debated issues, items that are on the order paper, and so forth. But that actually doesn't tell you very much. What's really interesting is when we get to the variables. So what are the variables that I'm thinking of? In terms of lawful access, it's principally around what are called focusing events. Focusing events are shocking items that arise that were unknown to the public, political, and media classes simultaneously. And so this could be something as simple or as small as an access to information request presenting itself, and all of a sudden we know that there's something going on that the government is doing that politicians themselves were unaware of. Or it could be entirely different. It could be a young woman commits suicide over bullying. And then all of a sudden, that focal event sees all the different actors, the media, members of the public, be they regular citizens or civil advocates or academics, or law enforcement, and they can all jump on to try and say, this is a symbol for why we need or don't need a piece of legislation, and it fits within the narrative that we've built up in one way or another. So to use the example of cyberbullying, the most recent iteration of lawful access, the deaths of 2 women, young women, as a result of bullying, have been picked up as the reason why we need lawful access. So here what we have is the use of symbolic politics, young children that need protection. That makes sense, and law enforcement is there to protect children. We know this is just what law enforcement does. Combined with a narrative that it makes sense to advance legislation so that we can let police protect children just like they did 20, 30 years ago. It makes sense to have these powers, because otherwise, if we don't, the police are unable to do their symbolic job of protecting children. And that's just an example of how you can pick up a symbol, try and put it within a narrative, and then try and use that as a proxy to justify your framing of an issue, i.e. lawful access is needed as the solution to, in that case, cyberbullying. So I'm going to be pointing throughout this talk to the use of particular focusing events and then how it's played out in these different agendas, often through the lens of different columnists or different politicians or different organizations that also contested the framing of issues that arose in addition to the legislation itself. But what is lawful access itself? At the highest of high levels, all lawful access refers to is powers that are meant to expand authorities, search and seizure powers, communications interception capabilities, and in many cases, subscriber data production powers. And I use the word authorities very generally, because in the Canadian context in particular, we normally think, or at least I normally think, about perhaps CSIS, Canadian Security Intelligence Services, maybe to a much lesser extent, CSAC, our signals intelligence body, but certainly the RCMP, local police, organizations that we identify with law enforcement. But included in Canada's lawful access legislation is all public authorities writ large. And so somewhat tongue-in-cheek, although accurate, it would apply to mayors, it would apply to individuals who are responsible for animal protection. Anyone who is designated as a public officer can utilize or could utilize many of the powers identified in the lawful access legislation. And so it's important that we, of course, consider how certain bodies, RCMP, CBSA, groups like that might use these, and they're going to be best equipped to. But in the future, it could be a much broader audience. And then the specific Canadian expansions that I list here are what we've seen the key pieces of what we've seen in the totality of over a decade of lawful access discussions. Some of them have not existed in different variations of the bill, but this is the full set. So in terms of subscriber data, what we've often seen in versions of the legislation is either a warrantless ability to demand access to subscriber data, or alternately, in the most recent iteration of the legislation, we've seen efforts that would authorize corporate bodies to disclose subscriber data absent a warrant. And importantly, they could choose to disclose it and in the process would be indemnified from criminal or civil action. That latter part is new. There's never been a previous discussion that you couldn't sue a company for breaking the law. If they broke a criminal law, there's never been a suggestion they should be indemnified for it. In terms of the particular data elements, it's included the name, the address, the phone number, the IMSI number in terms of mobile devices, the IMEI for mobile devices, your email, your IP address associated with your account, or the multiple IP addresses associated with your account. And it's also included the SPIN, or the number that's used to identify you when you're roaming on another carrier. One of the challenges with subscriber data in particular is that's what you get or could have got under different iterations of the legislation. What hasn't been defined is what is required to get that. And I don't mean in terms of legal process. I mean, what is the seed identifier required in order to identify that you want Christopher Parsons' subscriber information? In previous versions of the legislation, it's always been identified this will be addressed in the regulations following the legislation's passage. So whether that means that an IP address is sufficient to compel this, or your name, or your email, or some other variable that isn't defined in the legislation has been entirely unclear. And indeed, it's purposeful. The rationale for not including that specificity, based on conversations I've had with people at Justice, is by putting it into the regulations, it can be updated at any point. And so this is an issue that's over a decade old. So technology moves quite quickly, and as was pointed out to me at lunch, how can the law possibly keep track of changes in technology? Well, one of the ways you do it is you say, this is the bundle of data that we want, but the terms of accessing data, we're going to make that malleable and not have to go through a parliamentary process to update. Also included in lawful access has been new preservation and production orders. This would, on suspicion grounds, permit authorities to say, hold on to whatever the kind of data happens to be for 30 to 90 days, depending if it's for domestic access or or to assist foreign parties who are looking to get Canadian data. And then they would have to go to a judge or a justice and they would receive a production order. So the company would store it, hold on to it for a period of time, after which it would be disclosed. In various iterations of the legislation, preservation and production has been accompanied by gags, which would hinder or prevent the company from informing subscribers that this has gone on, or individual Canadians to access the rights under Canadian privacy law to know whether or not their data had ever been accessed. There's also been, controversially, both decryption and malware infection elements. So the decryption aspect applied to any time a telecommunications service provider, writ large, so not just Rogers, Bell, Shaw, sort of the ISPs that we think of, but potentially the Googles, the Facebooks, the Yahoos, all the internet services, generally, if they were involved in transforming the communication, i.e. if they were involved in the encryption process, and if they did not have to develop new techniques to decrypt, then they could be compelled to retain data for subsequent decryption. Now, what does that mean? One thing it means is the justice lawyers, this wasn't an accident in previous versions of the legislation. They did think that they could use it to apply to Tor, to make Tor an illegal application if it was unable to apply, although there's some legal jujitsu that went in through there. The other thing that they were worried about were things like perfect forward secrecy. In theory, it is possible to retain, say, the ephemeral keys that are generated. There's no transformation that needs to go on as far as justice is concerned. So even if you've set up perfect forward secrecy that generates ephemeral session keys for the encryption process, as far as this piece of legislation was concerned, service providers should be required to retain those session keys in case they're needed at a subsequent point to decrypt. Failure to do so could come with fines or other charges. Fortunately, that's been stripped out of this iteration of the legislation that we're looking at right now. Malware has not. Malware remains. So Citizen Lab has spent a lot of time documenting the malware industry and the sale of 0 days and targeted software kits for governments for law enforcement purposes. The way that malware would be used is exclusively at the moment, explicitly, for monitoring locational information. So the legislation would apply to the mobile devices that you carry with you. It would apply to your vehicles that you drive. They have a GPS or other geolocational functionality, as well as computers in a more broader definition. So in the case of locational purposes, or for locational devices, locational infections, software could be installed, activated, controlled, and removed covertly without the individual or, potentially, the service provider ever knowing that it had taken place. So if lawful access passes without amendment, the Canadian federal government will be in the malware business. The 0-day business will come here. Now, in addition, there is concern that it may also apply to the collection of metadata writ large. It isn't as explicit in the sense that it doesn't identify your mobile phone or your car or something like that in the current versions of the legislation, but it does include the covert ability to install, activate, monitor, and remove software monitoring systems. Now, whether that means that you would have to go to an ISP's router or your home router or some other element of the network infrastructure, that hasn't been spelled out. But in terms of locational monitoring, malware is a key component of the legislation. Other versions of the legislation have included government equipment deployments. This would be the government. If you as an organization were unable to intercept the way the government would like you to, the government could inspect your systems and, in theory, could lend equipment to you, quote unquote. This would involve working with top secret cleared officers in order to ensure that you could meet either RCMP, CSIS, or other agencies' requirements to monitor the communications or the communications flows of persons that were of interest and presumably have been issued with some sort of judicial warrant. But what's perhaps most worrying is quite often the fuzzy implementation. So I mentioned at the very beginning, speaking about subscriber data, the use of regulation. So through access to information, we learned just how many connections would have to be monitored. And remembering that this wouldn't just apply in law to Rogers Bell Facebook or Rogers Bell Shaw, but also the Facebooks, the Yahoos, anyone who provides an internet service. And so all of a sudden, you could be speaking about tens of thousands of Canadians based on Facebook's population, could theoretically at any time be monitored per the regulations. Facebook would have to maintain that capability. So that in itself is curious, interesting, shocking to some, although I guess it wouldn't necessarily blow anyone's socks off. But included in the regulations was a note. The minister at any time could identify that more intercepts are required by a particular service provider and then could write a ministerial order stating, okay, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 new requests, or maybe 5, 10, 30,000 more requests are required. And the government would pay for the equipment, they would pay for the cost of doing business. But what it means is that even the initial regulations as they were set out are conditional. They could be changed all without ever going back to Parliament. And indeed, the actual implementation guides were not public until they were successfully accessed through access to information requests. So this is generally what lawful access, what the key parts of the buffet that the government has been curious to acquire over the past decade or so. But as you can see, this started in 2001. It has moved all the way through to today. So in 2001, Canada signed on to the Convention on Cybercrime. This included some perhaps uncontroversial elements that, given the growth of the internet, all signatory nations had to agree to certain things as being illegal. So what were some of the things that included? The interception or modification of communications. It called for greater powers or greater laws to curb child pornography, also copyright infringement. But most significantly, new powers to quote-unquote catch up to the digital era. And this is where we get the preservation, the production orders, not subscriber requests. Those are a Canadian add-on, made in Canada. And not including the malware provisions or many of the most egregious elements. But it's from 2001 that we get a line, a narrative, if you will, that courses through the next decade, where the government persistently says lawful access is needed to meet treaty obligations. So the narrative is all of our allies have done this. We're just one of the Western democratic nations, and Western democratic nations pass these laws. So it's time for Canada to pass a Western democratic law. It's been many years, and so perhaps it may not be so Western democratic. So we have one consultation that happens in 2002, and it's huge. Over 300 people have sent in written submissions. It includes members of academia, it includes members of industry, it includes law enforcement, vendors, telecommunications providers. No Facebook because they're not around yet, but there are some early proto-internet companies, or internet service companies rather, that do provide comments. And out of this, we moved to a consultation in 2005 before the introduction of MITA, but this is small. Gone are the civil advocates. Gone are the academics, largely, and instead it's focused on industry, vendors, and LEAs, i.e., how are we going to implement this? How hard is it going to be to do? How expensive is it going to be to do? And what do we need to do in order to get industry on the government's side? And that's significant because in the 2002 consultations, you had an interesting pairing. You had civil society, academics, and ISPs all on the same side. They were all opposed. Why? The ISPs weren't terribly concerned about privacy. They weren't that concerned about implementation. They were really concerned about cost, and with it being quote-unquote standards compliant, i.e. they didn't want to develop their own internal systems for the government's purposes. Come 2005, going forward, the government says, okay, we will find some kind of fiscal arrangement, generally, and we're probably willing to meet you halfway at least, if not all the way, on standards compliant. So all of a sudden, civil society and industry are largely separated. MITA is introduced, the Modernization of Interception Technologies Act. I think that's what that one stands for. The Modernization of Investigative Techniques Act. It included subscriber data disclosures, as was mentioned earlier. It required telecommunications service providers to make all their products interceptable. Not just the ones they had now, and they could retrofit those to be interceptable, but any new product that was developed and introduced also had to meet the same intercept standards. So before a new product could be offered, be it email, voice over IP, whatever it happened to be, it had to meet government intercept requirements. It also had the preservation and production orders, but throughout, there's no clear symbol. 9/11 was pointed to, we need to stop the terrorists, but nothing had happened in Canada. And so the government wasn't able to really develop a strong symbol and narrative, other than really at that point it was, we need to stop terrorists, they're bad people, and we need to meet treaty obligations. And they weren't really able to justify or explain why exactly these powers are needed. Ultimately, it died on the order paper when an election was called, it was on the agenda, the political agenda, for 2 or 3 weeks. It wasn't enough time to really incite either the public or the media to substantively pick it up. And so it just sort of died away. And then came to the 2007 consultations, which were one of the most important consultations and that had nothing to do with the consultation itself, really. So again, you had a small group of industry folks come together with government. It was quiet, it was closed, academics weren't notified, civil society wasn't notified. It was only when Michael Geist discovered, oh, this is going on, and got access to the document that people were invited into the tent. But that really doesn't matter. What mattered is what the minister said. The Minister of Justice at the time said warrants would be required in order to receive information from telecommunications companies. And that has spun all the way through the debates. Warrants must be required. A previous Conservative minister said it. Why is that absent in the next generations of the legislation? Again, 2009, the legislation is introduced. It died when Parliament prorogued. It was not something that the Harper government was in any way willing to die on its sword for. It had far more important pressing issues with minority coalitions forming. And so again, the legislation goes away. In all of these cases, the legislation is, up until 2009, legislation has not been a priority. It's been introduced, it's been politically useful, and then it washes away. Fast forward to 2010, 12, and 13, and we start seeing the legislation as more and more important. So by 2010, we've seen advocates have come together. There have been meetings around the country. We've seen the government start developing direct talking points back to civil society and academia. And we've seen the media finally understand what the issue is. You start seeing editorials in the National Post, the Globe and Mail. You start seeing the Toronto Star and their national security correspondents start writing about it on a regular basis. Come to 2012, and you have another shocking moment where Vic Tay stands up and says, if you oppose lawful access, you're in support of child pornography. Another symbol that was jumped on. And the aim was, again, if you believe in Western democratic lawful systems, you want to stop child pornographers, and therefore you want to vote for this bill. That was perhaps not well thought out in his head, but that's what I think he meant to say. And instead, he incited a firestorm, smear politics, and again, got picked up, the media jumped on it, and the government was willing to set it aside and let it quietly die. But now we're in a new version of the legislation. C30, we had civil society that was organized. We had a series of videos that came out to shock people. Cops are going to listen to your telephone. The most onerous elements of the legislation are gone. Subscriber data can be disclosed. It's not must be disclosed, although ISPs will be legally safe for providing this. Preservation and production is there, malware is there, decryption isn't. ISPs won't have to install government hardware or software. It's a better piece of legislation. Not great, but better. But this is all legislation, and this is what has been in the media. This is what's been in the public mind. The government was incredibly clever in 2012, 2013, and they engaged in issue segmentation. How many people enjoy LTE on their phones? As part of the most recent spectrum auction, there was a discussion. Okay, let's figure out the most equitable way of making sure spectrum is divided. So there's an Industry Canada discussion. How do we do this? Why? Massive, long, boring, terrible. Don't read it. It's not pleasant. But hidden inside it was a slight wording change. So all of a sudden, this thing called the Solicitor General's Enforcement Standards would apply to not just circuit-based communications, but radio-based communications. That's it, just a small definitional change, because the time that we live in now, we use radios, not circuits, so it makes sense for that. And by the way, there's some changes to the Solicitor General's Enforcement Standards stuff, but we'll get to that. The government will get to that some other time, don't worry about it. So what was actually going on there? No civil society member had any idea what was going on. None. It was a black box. The telcos jumped up and down, and why? Because in that slight definitional change, historically, any phone that you purchase in Canada has to be subject to intercept capabilities. Requirement to have spectrum in this country. You have to comply with what's called the Solicitor General's Enforcement Standards, the SGES. The telcos have understood this to mean, your text messages, they have to be able to capture your fax. If you send a fax somehow through a phone or through a wireless signal, that has to be intercepted. Telephone calls, interceptable. The list goes on of sort of standard telecommunications that we think about. In this shift, it would apply to every packet-based communication that goes through a radio. So if you pair your phone to your laptop, interceptable. If you send email, interceptable. If you watch TV on your phone, interceptable. And at the same time that this was going on, and the telcos were freaking out, at one point saying that Industry Canada had no right, no mandate to do this absent law, i.e., you can't do this without lawful access. That's what you're trying to get us to do. At the same time, through access to information, we uncovered that the same debate was going on in government. It was put forward by public safety intentionally because they didn't think they could get lawful access through, and this was the quote-unquote stopgap. They were going to massively expand the surveillance capability of federal agencies, all without going through the legislature, which they had been blocked in for over a decade. But what we also saw is, while it was a high priority item internal to the government for public safety, Industry Canada was not interested. And the other party that was strongly opposed to it was none other than CSIS. CSIS saw no value in going through this fight again because they didn't think it would be successful. So ultimately, the telcos won. But why did they win? On the one hand, they presented actually united opposition to something, which was curious. But the other is, within the government itself, it wasn't a high priority agenda item. It managed to sink down because of internal squabbling. And so this was the one point the government has had over the past decade and a half almost, where lawful access almost became reality. And if you make a request for the Solicitor General's enforcement standards, you will not receive them because you are not permitted to see them. And if you do manage to get a hold of them, you won't see the annotations that explain what they mean. And if you do get a copy of the annotated version, which you can download from the Globe and Mail, I point out, after someone leaked it to them, you can be threatened because just possessing them, despite their not being classified, not being protected, they're regarded as a quasi-national security secret by members of the government. And so the SGS is one of the best kept, now less best kept secrets in how intercepts, wiretaps, and data communication monitoring occurs. And included in that, of course, is the ability to monitor any phone at any time as to where it's physically located, as well as the methods by which it must be reported back. So to date, what has impeded lawful access? It hasn't been a high priority government item. It's always been secondary. Moreover, academics, advocates, opposition members have been very successful in raising problems with both the legislation and identifying contentious data. So most recently, in terms of C13, there have been a pair of major focusing events. The first was the revelation by MP Charmaine Borg that CBSA, the Border Services Agency, had in 1 year requested subscriber data 19,000 times. This is after decades of the government saying it's impossible to get access to subscriber data. Their success rate was almost 100%. And so that was polarizing in the sense that all of a sudden there was hard numbers for the first time. It wasn't just civil advocates and opposition members saying this has to stop because it's not needed, but in fact we could prove that the clauses in the legislation were already being exploited without the legislation having been passed. The other thing that we discovered is the Privacy Commissioner of Canada released documents showing that there were 1.2 million requests for subscriber information in a single year. Again, indicating that the powers that the government was insisting were absolutely necessary to stop criminal activity wasn't necessarily the case. And then finally, legal scholars wrote a series of pieces that identified how exactly the young women who had killed themselves tragically, how the people who had harassed them could have been brought to jail, or could have been charged, absent new powers. And in fact, in one case, that's exactly what's happened. absent lawful access, every time the government has said, we need these powers to stop this crime, when sufficiently motivated, the existing tools and mechanisms of law have been sufficient to identify, capture, and remedy the most egregious examples that the government has held up. So what are the ways of impeding the current version of lawful access? So C13 is different. Many of the worst elements have been stripped away. Moreover, it's been introduced in Parliament. It's gone through its second reading. The government seems very inclined to push it ahead. They may not. So when I wrote this piece in February, I said pessimistic. It was going through. There was no way that any of us saw it really stopping. So I hypothesized if they're national security leaks, transparency reporting and disclosure, or government accountability, any of these things might actually derail lawful access. Despite all the excellent documents we received from Edward Snowden and possibly a second leaker, there have been no glaring national security leaks that have derailed lawful access in a substantive way. All of the leaks have largely applied to our signals intelligence agency, and the Canadian media has been mediocre at best at reporting that. However, we have started getting transparency reporting and disclosure. So here we've started to see ISPs themselves push back. We've seen how many times is government making requests for personal information. So in the case of Rogers, it's over 200,000 times. In the case of TechSavvy, just in the tens or the hundreds, so very low. But that's causing a problem within government because now they're concerned that the telcos are no longer fully on side. Just paying their costs is no longer fully sufficient to guarantee the telcos will just advance or support the legislation. In terms of government accountability, we're starting to see MPs issue legally binding questions to identify the regularity at which the government is accessing communications, the tools that they are using to access those communications, and their willingness or ability to disclose what they're doing to citizens. So MP Charmaine Borg, Privacy Commissioner of Canada, have both started providing empirical data that threatens the narrative that the government has put forward. These are necessary tools that Western democratic states developed, adopt, and if we don't have these tools, we can't ask for this information because we won't get it. Facts are just empirically proving that that is not the case, combined with the telecommunications companies who had once been on side starting to go offside some. So, will C13 pass? It's in part going to depend on a series of whether or not we can meet the best practices for opposition. As I mentioned, the government investment in the issue historically has been quite low. This has not been number 1, 2, 3, or 10 on the federal government's priority list. There have been other matters that have taken their attention. The economic crisis absorbed huge swaths of the federal government's attention. Various trade issues with the United States have taken huge amounts of time for the Prime Minister's office. But now we've gotten to a point where even when Peter MacKay, the current minister who's heralding or shepherding this bill through, even when he makes misstatements or flat out mistruths to the House, that isn't sufficient for the Prime Minister to say, okay, we're going to put a hold on the legislation. Even when the newly appointed Privacy Commissioner from Justice, who has received criticism in the past from the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, even when he says this legislation has to be slowed down, stomped, and split, it's not enough. Even when the victims, or rather the families of the victims of these young women who have killed themselves, even when they say, we need to slow down, that hasn't been sufficient to derail this government from its interest in advancing the legislation. So that's going to be a challenge because where there's mediocre or low government investment in an issue, raising issues on the media or public agendas can be successful in pushing it away from sort of political channels, it can reduce political interest. We're not at that point. In turn, it's important as to how responsive the media and the public actually is to the issue. So I wrote this in February. There was no coverage of C13 of any meaningful type. That was very different from C50, 51, 52, C30, and other versions of lawful access, where civil society had been outraged, academics had been outraged, the media had been writing about it persistently, And that just didn't happen. It's changed. And it's changed because of Charmaine Borg's requests, the Privacy Commissioner of Canada's requests, a little bit of the work that we've done at the lab. And so we have a responsive media and public agenda. We've seen surveys that show that most Canadians, in the tune of 60 to 70%, oppose lawful access in its current form when posed questions. So there's hostility to the legislation, but whether that hostility is sufficient to overcome the government's investment isn't clear. But when government investment in an issue is low, such high responsiveness in the media and public agendas can drive an issue away. Another best practice is the preparing or the generation of focusing events. So sometimes these happen. Sometimes they're like lightning that strikes, and everyone sort of jumps around them. An example would be the McNota killing. So the government, no one could predict that there would be a deranged killer who would kill his friend and housemate, and the government jumped on it as, we need lawful access because lawful access would let us catch and prevent this kind of thing. I would note, without lawful access, we still caught him. So that's one kind of event, and then everyone tries to squirm and figure out how narratives and symbols will come together. But the other way it works is you sit on data, you sit on information long enough, and you prep the media, and you wait, and then you drop something. With the idea being, even though one of the parties may know about this event could be coming, no one else does. So in terms of the media, the broader public, and politicians, they have to react. And so there's an opportunity there to take control of the narrative and to structure the way that the debate is framed. So examples would be, I have a strong suspicion the Privacy Commissioner of Canada did not accidentally release, when she did, the number of requests the government had been making. Civil society groups such as Open Media have, in many cases, deliberately held on to data that they've held or campaign materials, waiting for a moment in the media cycle when they knew it would resonate the most. And indeed, the government has held on to data in various instances, waiting until it was most opportune for them to drop it and then control the media cycle to justify lawful access. So in terms of opposition, the collection of access to information, if advocacy groups do planning, and just waiting. And then the final practice that is important is a diversified set of experts. So this is helpful for more than one reason. One, it means you can actually cover an issue properly, and that you have people who spend time in politics, security, communications, and they can all analyze an issue from different perspectives. So on the one hand, that means that you have a full comprehensive understanding of the legislation. On the other, it means that when the media has a question or they're interested or they're piqued, they can keep being fed new stories. So in terms of the public, most of the time that you've heard an issue, after 3 weeks, the likelihood of changing someone's opinion in the public is very hard. So there's been a series of studies in the US where after about 5 weeks max of campaign literature, as an example, during American campaigns, people have made up their minds, they're done. The same is often true of things like, should we build a road, or do we need more money to firefighters, or something like that. 3 to 5 weeks, most people have made a decision. But with a diversified set of experts, it's no longer a lawful access issue. It's a malware issue. It's a subscriber data issue. It's a preservation issue. It's a car issue. It's a insert all the different understandings of the issue that the various experts have. And so again, you can attract public interest. You can get the public very interested and possibly hostile. You can attract the media because it's a new news story that's related to a larger series, simply by having diversified experts who know what they're talking about and who can explain it in an accessible way to the public, to the media, and to parliamentarians. And again, those bottom 3 items have the ability to then change the way the government understands an issue. Should it go forward or should it not? But what's going forward? I was pessimistic when I wrote the book chapter. Currently, we've seen more movement than ever before. There's 2 constitutional challenges around the collection of this kind of information, one by signals intelligence, one the disclosure of it by ISPs to law enforcement. There's a class action suit against the collection of metadata. There's a series of parliamentarians who are introducing legislation and private members' bill to curtail the proposals in the lawful access legislation. There was a Supreme Court decision that said that the voluntary disclosure of subscriber information or the disclosure of that information with what's called a PIPED, a letter from a police officer without judicial approval, that can't go on any further, which draws into question the subscriber disclosure processes. There's been a series of important legal changes, to say nothing of Mr. Snowden's ongoing drip, 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 that has meant that there's actually, I think, more hope now than there was several months ago. And the one thing that is absent in this talk, this is politics, but the one thing that's absent is there is a full game book, and you can download it from the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association website, that explains why every element of lawful access raises constitutional challenges, constitutional concerns. So even if lawful access is passed, whether it's in this version or it's in the next sitting of Parliament or the next government when they're introduced, even when or if lawful access is passed, there's the next step, and that's the long, hard, cold, unpleasant legal slog. So even if the legislation goes through, I guess there's still some hope as long as we can trust the lawyers. So in case you're interested in getting a hold of me, here's my contact information, and the various people, part of the requirements for all the money that they give me. My research has been funded by SSHRC, the New Transparency Project, the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, Council of Global Affairs, and most recently, the Canadian Internet Registration Authority. And I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have about the legislation or the processes that are ongoing or anything else related to the topic.
So I heard a very strong message from your talk as to how government is after our data. The reasoning behind that message or that voice wasn't very compelling, because you said just because everybody else is doing it, our governments want to do the same thing. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that. And then secondly, we talked about getting access to our private data, but the fact of the matter is, as citizens or as people, we seem very easy to give away our information. There's a lot of examples are other. I think you mentioned your talk, Facebook, Twitter, use of Google products, for example. There's a lot of opportunities for the government not to even go through difficult means to get information about us. And then we're willing to provide that for service in return. So your thoughts on that?
So with regards to your first, you're absolutely right. My apologies. So the two questions were, one, in my talk, I didn't really clearly articulate, I didn't present a strong argument for why the government wants access to this information. And then the follow-up is, if citizens are providing all this information already voluntarily, often to private companies, what exactly is the problem? So with regards to the first, that's not accidental. And part of the reason is there hasn't been a strong drive. There's been an opportunistic, something has gone on, and therefore that justifies the legislation. So terrorism has happened, therefore we need the legislation. Child pornography occurs, therefore we need the legislation. Cyberbullying occurs, therefore we need the legislation. And so the rationale from law enforcement predominantly has been it's very hard and very costly to get warrants. Telecommunications providers do not voluntarily provide this information, and so our investigations are being endangered. The problem is that empirically that isn't borne out. So at one point the government was insisting that there was a very low rate of compliance. And in fact, it turned out that ISPs were voluntarily providing information something like 97.6% of the time. And in those other instances, it was the ISP pushing back and saying, no, I think you need a warrant before we can provide that information.
But in your talk, you also hinted that governments are waiting for these opportunities or these events to take place, and then they will jump on it, right? So that, to me, actually speaks that there is an inherent interest from the government to say, look, we need this data. Let's figure out how we're going to get to it.
Yeah, so
I understand why that inherent interest is there from the government.
Sure. So the follow-up was, I pointed in the talk repeatedly that, government keeps jumping on the issue, so clearly there's an inherent interest. What is it? And there's just an interest in having the data. So it comes from a variety of different perspectives. On the one hand, it's we simply have people that are learning from their international partners. RCMP goes and trains with the FBI, trains with Scotland Yard, trains with people all around the world who do have these powers, and they can see, oh gee, if we had preservation or production, then our investigations would move faster perhaps. Or if we had subscriber disclosure, then we could start developing databases to understand social movements more appropriately or more accurately. And so one of the key things in the various bits of legislation has been a movement from a reason to believe something is going on in order to get access to data to a reason to suspect something is going on in order to gain access to this data. The variation is important. Reasonable grounds to suspect is usually used for intelligence gathering. So as an example, it could be someone uses privacy-enhancing technologies on a regular basis. We've seen them hang out with people who we don't trust for whatever reason it might be. We want to know more about that person because they are a suspicious person. So this is intelligence gathering at the police level, and we've seen a change in policing over the past decade and a half or so, at least, to more intelligence-led policing. And so part of the push for lawful access, arguably, is to facilitate that logic of police wanting to collect intelligence rather than prosecute after the fact. However, the opportunistic element indicates that there isn't a clear, strong narrative all the way through. Or if there is, in the case of the one that I just provided, that I believe quite strongly it's related to intelligence gathering for law enforcement, that isn't a narrative that the government believes sort of will resonate with Canadian people. Explaining that the RCMP or CRA or CBSA or local police should be involved in intelligence collection isn't something that's going to work terribly well or very convincingly outside of a particular block of voters. Therefore, they go to these symbols, they go to these narratives to try and justify on totally different grounds, while internal to the government and throughout law enforcement, there still is this underlying, we need it for intelligence purposes. Does that help?
So I think to me it sounds like the driving force is really, we are getting influenced by other bigger powers, I think what you're saying. And realizing that it's easy to do it this way, as opposed to doing it right or doing it properly. And
Yeah.
the ease of use and other compelling aspects around us are basically driving us to do this.
So
There's no real reason to do this.
yeah, so the comment was, it seems as though international pressures are really what's significantly behind this, and I would agree. I mean, this began with in 2001 with the signing of the Convention on Cybercrime, and I think that we've seen our allies largely adopt measures that are in some countries being challenged for legality reasons at this point. But no, I think that's a fair estimation. And then just quickly to your second question, which was, we're giving away all this data already to private companies. Isn't talking about privacy in this context sort of maybe not ironic, but what's going on? So I think that so in Canada, under the federal government cannot collect the personal information of citizens without a clear and reasonable ground to do so. And that isn't just like a law enforcement reason. It's like they can't trawl your Twitter or mine your Facebook without saying we are doing it for this stated government purpose. And then they have to go through sort of a data protection process, how are we protecting it? And they can't then take that data and share it all over the place.
Yeah, but they can ask another company to do that collection and then say, well, tell us who's doing this type of activity. That's still legal, right?
And there are ways to sort of move around.
Yeah.
But I think what's significant is, and this is in some respects a little bit trite, but I actually tend to agree with Eric Schmidt a little bit on this. We provide a lot of information to Google as an example, but at the same time, although it's changing as we learn more about Snowden, Google can't send a drone to do anything to you. And so the provision of data for commercial purposes is for a particular aim, a particular commercial aim. Whereas the accessing of that information by government, there's a very different set of powers that come into play there. And so that's why some sort of due process to receive this information from corporate sources to government is needed. And also limitation clauses as to when this data has been collected. This is the only reason it can be used for. And one of the dangers, separate from lawful access discussions, but we've seen the federal government, as well as provincial governments and municipal governments alike, adopting processes. So I will collect information at the suspicion level for intelligence gathering, some sort of blasé, bland, generic rationale. And then it can be shared across other government agencies because the purpose is still the same. It's for intelligence gathering or intelligence sharing. And so that's the other dimension that's challenging, is when that information comes from the companies, where does it go, how does it go, why does it go? And so I don't think that most consumers sort of post on Facebook, love the minister's hair with the expectation it then gets, on one of his staffers' desks.
Yeah, but there's numerous studies where you can figure out the political orientation of people or
Mhm.
their sexual tendencies by looking at their social media data.
Yep.
Right? So it's not difficult to infer just from people.
Yeah, and so that's the follow-up is you can infer it from analysis, and yes, and private companies do that, and they provide that kind of service back to the government. But it's typically not a provision of the raw data itself. It's understanding the voter block. And so there's a level of abstraction that in theory is going on.
Could you comment a bit on the impact of the legislations on researchers themselves? Because this room's full of people who work on privacy-enhancing technologies. I mean, it sounds like at some point between conception and implementation and commercialization, they may become illegal or forced to be modified to allow intercept or something like that.
So the question is, what's the implication of lawful access for researchers, and how does it affect people who are developing privacy-enhancing technologies? The most current iteration of the legislation doesn't have the decryption requirement, and so that's very positive. And if you're providing a service, so you're an internet service, there isn't the government mandates that you can install, that you have certain interception capabilities. So that's also removed from this part of the legislation. What could still be a challenge or a concern is the recognition that malware is a viable way of trying to counter privacy-enhancing technologies. So if your aim is to anonymize or protect location, explicitly, this legislation would authorize the attack of the device itself. And so there you're potentially dealing with how do I harden the client. The other challenge is within the context of voluntary disclosure of subscriber data. If you're providing a privacy protective service, you probably would just say, no, I'm not doing that. But there's the concern of, even if your element is secure, you have to make sure that any of your partners or upstream providers that are also captured within the definition of TSPs are also not able to disclose any information about the subscribers in question. So,
Are you compelled to change your business practices if it's, just turn on logging, for example?
well, not per this legislation. However, there is a movement afoot. The follow-up was, per this legislation, our implementation change is going to be required. Not in this version of the legislation. However, I was in an event recently where law enforcement is emphatic that carrier-grade NAT is a huge problem, which involves the assignment of ports to a series of IP addresses in order to just engage in NAT at a carrier level. So in that case, there's a discussion that we should have regulation that if ISPs, if somehow the Apache Foundation isn't going to automatically enable logging to capture all IP port combinations for all subscribers at all times, then we will find regulation to require that. I think that that's more pie in the sky dreaming, but certainly this is one segment of the Canadian discussion, but internationally there are a lot of discussions as to how do we enhance the monitoring of communications for law enforcement purposes.
So thanks for the talk, very interesting. Something which I find curious when I see things like this is how we sort of got here. So we're in a situation where democratic governments are advocating for intelligence-like surveillance powers, not just for intelligence agencies, but for police forces, presumably to share information, as you said, with government departments and so on. And so I guess I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what caused this transition from a world where these were powers reserved for intelligence services to a world where we're talking about extending them, or in some cases have extended them to police services, and whether maybe it's a technological product, it's just that we can do this now, or it's a gradual shift, or it's something that comes about as a result of 9/11 or other terrorist events, but something like that.
Yeah. So the question was sort of what has brought about the call for lawful access style powers? Is it technology? Is it certain events have taken place? Why are we even dealing with this issue as it stands right now? I think that there's a series of responses, actually. So on the one hand, we were seeing a shift to intelligence-led policing in the 90s. So the rise of the Convention on Cybercrime Agreement, that was built out of what was going on both domestically in Canada and with our allied partners. But the other thing that happened, I mean, you can't ignore it. There were a series of severe terrorist attacks that shocked both Canadians and Americans and countries around the world. So 9/11 had a severe impact, which has facilitated a shift in policing generally, so not just in Canada, but also in the US and others, to move to an intelligence-based process on the basis that it is better to, this is the sort of the argument, it's better to minimally infringe on liberties so that we can keep people safe. And so it's an understandable and in many ways laudable sort of way of approaching things. However, in the wake of various terrorist attacks, changes in public psyche to some extent, we haven't seen the pushback that we normally get. So quite often after a major event of this type, you have some disproportionate reaction and then gradually it equalizes again. I think that we're gradually moving towards equalization. So you're seeing that in the US with senators starting to push back against elements of state surveillance. You're seeing elements of pushing back against aerial intelligence gathering by law enforcement. You're seeing victims groups push back in Canada on elements of intelligence powers within the lawful access legislation. But I think that we're still going to, whenever this ends, it will legalize techniques and powers that will expand intelligence gathering. And part of that's just we've changed the way we understand policing, and police forces in turn have changed. So this is to fit within the new logic of policing.
Okay, we're out of time, so let's thank Chris again. And Chris will be meeting with students in the lab DC 3332 right when he packs up. The next talk in the Chris speaker series on privacy is in 3 weeks